Hi everyone, can you hear me? I want to make sure that my audio is fine before I dive right into the reading. Today is going to be part 2 of Coraline by Neil Gaiman. 2 weeks ago, I read up to chapter 5, which was about an hour long. And so I'm going to be reading another hour's worth of the book. But fear not, if we don't get to finish the story today, I will be back to make sure we get to the end of the story. I decided to change my look a little bit because my mom makes this house very cold for no reason. And so, yes, I am wearing a sweater. I'm secretly my grandma's favorite. Okay, so I'm waiting for more people to trickle in. Okay, so you guys hear me fine. People always tell me they can't hear me and to speak louder, that I am the quietest Cuban American they've ever met. I see you, Jasleiney. I see you. Thank you. Okay, great. So I have a good amount of people here, and everyone says that they can hear me. So let's start. Once again, this is part 2. We left off sorry, I have hair in my face. Starting in chapter 5. And let's see how far we get for the next hour. And yeah, and if you want to catch up, the lives are still up on Facebook and YouTube if you don't know the story, aren't familiar with the story. But basically, we're starting off now where Coraline just met her other father and her other mother, and they have black button eyes, and they were trying to convince her to also stay with them forever and ever, but she needs to also sew in her own pair of black button eyes, and it's terrifying. So she goes back home, where her real mom and dad are, and that's where we're starting off. Okay, let me position everything. Okay. Coraline locked the door of the drawing room with the cold black key. She went back into the kitchen and climbed onto a chair. She tried to put the bunch of keys back on top of the door frame again. She tried 4 or 5 times before she was forced to accept that she just wasn't big enough, and she put them down on the counter next to the door. Her mother still hadn't returned from her shopping expedition. Coraline went to the freezer and took out the spare loaf of frozen bread in the bottom compartment. She made herself some toast with jam and peanut butter. She drank a glass of water. She waited for her parents to come back. When it began to get dark, Coraline microwaved herself a frozen pizza. Then Coraline watched television. She wondered why grown-ups gave themselves all the good programs with all the shouting and running around in. After a while, she started yawning. Then she undressed, brushed her teeth, and put herself to bed. In the morning, she went into her parents' room, but their bed hadn't been slept in, and they weren't around. She ate canned spaghetti for breakfast. For lunch, she had a block of cooking chocolate and an apple. The apple was yellow and slightly shriveled, but it tasted sweet and good. For tea, she went down to Mrs. Spink and Forcible. She had 3 digestive biscuits, a glass of limeade, and a cup of weak tea. The limeade was very interesting. It didn't taste anything like limes. It tasted bright green and vaguely chemical. Coraline liked it enormously. She wished they had it at home. "How are your dear mother and father?" asked Miss Spink. "Missing," said Coraline. "I haven't seen either of them since yesterday. I'm on my own. I think I've probably become a single-child family." Tell your mother that we found the Glasgow Empire Press clippings we were telling her about. She seemed very interested when Miriam mentioned them to her. She's vanished under mysterious circumstances, said Coraline. I believe my father has as well. I'm afraid we'll be out all day tomorrow, Caroline, lovey, said Miss Forcible. We'll be staying over with April's niece in Royal Turnbridge Wells. They showed Coraline a photographic album with photographs of Miss Spink's niece in it, and then Coraline went home. She opened her money box and walked down to the supermarket. She bought 2 large bottles of limeade, a chocolate cake, and a new bag of apples, and went back home and ate them for dinner. She cleaned her teeth and went into her father's office. She woke up his computer and wrote a story. Coraline's story. There was a girl, her name was Apple. She used to dance a lot. She danced and danced until her feet turned into sausages, the end. She printed out the story and turned off the computer. Then she drew a picture of the little girl dancing underneath the words on the paper. She ran herself a bath with too much bubble bath in it, and the bubbles ran over the side and went all over the floor. She dried herself and the floor as best as she could and went to bed. Coraline woke up in the night. She went into her parents' bedroom, but the bed was made and empty. The glowing green numbers on the digital clock glowed 3:12 a.m. All alone in the middle of the night, Coraline began to cry. There was no other sound in the empty flat. She climbed into her parents' bed, and after a while, she went to sleep. Coraline was woken by cold paws batting her face. She opened her eyes. Big green eyes stared back at her. It was the cat. "Hello," said Coraline. "How did you get in?" The cat didn't say anything. Coraline got out of bed. She was wearing a long t-shirt and pajama bottoms. "Have you come to tell me something?" The cat yawned, which made its eyes flash green. "Do you know where Mommy and Daddy are?" The cat blinked at her, slowly. "Is that a yes?" The cat blinked again. Coraline decided that that was indeed a yes. "Will you take me to them?" The cat stared at her. Then it walked out into the hall. She followed it. It walked the length of the corridor and stopped down at the very end where a full-length mirror hung. The mirror had been, a long time before, the inside of a wardrobe door. It had been hanging there on the wall when they moved in, and although Coraline's mother had spoken occasionally of replacing it with something newer, she never had. Coraline turned on the light in the hall. The mirror showed the corridor behind her. That was only to be expected. But reflected in the mirror were her parents. They stood awkwardly in the reflection of the hall. They seemed sad and alone. As Coraline watched, they waved to her slowly with limp hands. Coraline's father had his arm around his mother. In the mirror, Coraline's mother and father stared at her. Her father opened his mouth and said something, but she could not hear anything at all. Her mother breathed on the inside of the mirror glass, and quickly, before the fog faded, she wrote, "Help us," with the tip of her forefinger. The fog on the inside of the mirror faded, and so did her parents, and now the mirror reflected only the corridor and Coraline and the cat. "Where are they?" Coraline asked the cat. The cat made no reply, but Coraline could imagine its voice, dry as a dead fly on a windowsill in winter, saying, "Well, where do you think they are?" "They aren't going to come back, are they?" said Coraline. "Not under their own steam." The cat blinked at her. Coraline took it as a yes. "Right," said Coraline. "Then I suppose there is only one thing left to do." She walked into her father's study. She sat down at his desk. Then she picked up the telephone and she opened the phone book and telephoned the local police station. "Police," said a gruff male voice. "Hello," she said. "My name is Coraline Jones." "You're up a bit after your bedtime, aren't you, young lady?" said the policeman. "Possibly," said Coraline, who was not going to be diverted, "but I am ringing to report a crime." "And what sort of crime would that be?" "Kidnapping. Grown-up kidnapping, really. My parents have been stolen away into a world on the other side of the mirror in our hall." "And how do you know who stole them?" asked the police officer. Coraline could hear the smile in his voice, and she tried extra hard to sound like an adult might sound to make him take her seriously. "I think my other mother has them both in her clutches. She may want to keep them and sew eyes with black buttons, and sew their eyes with black buttons, or she may simply have them in order to lure me back into reach of her fingers. I'm not sure." "Ah, the nefarious clutches of her fiendish fingers, is it?" he said. You know what I suggest, Miss Jones?" "No," said Coraline. "What?" "You ask your mother to make you a big old mug of hot chocolate, and then give you a great big old hug. There's nothing like hot chocolate and a hug for making the nightmares go away, and if she starts to tell you off for waking her up at this time of night, why, you tell her that's what the policeman said." He had a deep, reassuring voice. Coraline was not reassured. "When I see her," said Coraline, "I shall tell her that," and she put down the telephone. The black cat, who had sat on the door grooming his fur through this entire conversation, now stood up and led the way into the hall. Coraline went back into her bedroom and put on her blue dressing gown and her slippers. She looked under the sink for a flashlight and found one, but the batteries had long since run down, and it barely glowed with the faintest straw-colored light. She put it down again and found a box of, in case of emergency, white wax candles, and thrust one into a candlestick. She put an apple into each pocket. She picked up the ring of keys and took the old black key off the ring. She walked into the drawing room and looked at the door. She had the feeling that the door was looking at her, which she knew was silly, and knew on a deeper level was somehow true. She went back into her bedroom and rummaged in the pocket of her jeans. She found the stone with the hole in it, and put it into her dressing gown pocket. She lit the candle wick with a match and watched it sputter and light. Then she picked up the black key. It was cold in her hand. She put it into the keyhole in the door, but did not turn the key. "When I was a little girl," said Coraline to the cat, "when we lived in our old house a long, long time ago, my dad took me for a walk on the wasteland between our house and the shops. It wasn't the best place to go for a walk, really. There were all these things that people had thrown away back there, old cookers and broken dishes and dolls with no arms and legs and empty cans and broken bottles. Mom and Dad made me promise not to go exploring back there because there were too many sharp things and tetanus and such. But I kept telling them that I wanted to explore it. So one day, my dad put on his big brown boots and his gloves and put my boots on me and my jeans and sweater, and we went for a walk. We must have walked for about 20 minutes. We went down this hill to the bottom of a gully where a stream was, when my dad suddenly said to me, 'Coraline, run away, run up the hill, now.' He said it in a tight sort of way, urgently, so I did. I ran away up the hill. Something hurt me on the back of my arm as I ran, but I kept running. As I got to the top of the hill, I heard somebody thundering up the hill behind me. It was my dad, charging like a rhino. And when he reached me, he picked me up in his arms and swept me over the edge of the hill. And then we stopped, and we puffed, and we panted, and we looked back down the gully. The air was alive with yellow wasps. We must have stepped on a wasp's nest in a rotten branch as we walked, and while I was running up the hill, my dad stayed and got stung to give me time to run away. His glasses had fallen off when he ran. I only had the one sting on the back of my arm. He had 39 stings. All over him. We counted later in the bath. The black cat began to wash its face and whiskers in a manner that indicated increasing impatience. Coraline reached down and stroked the back of its head and neck. The cat stood up, walked several paces until it was out of her reach, and then it sat down and looked up at her again. "So," said Coraline, "later that afternoon my dad went back again to the wasteland to get his glasses back. He said if he left it another day, he wouldn't be able to remember where they'd fallen. And soon he got home wearing his glasses. He said that he wasn't scared when he was standing there and the wasps were stinging him and hurting him and he was watching me run away because he knew he had to give me enough time to run or the wasps would have come after both of us." Coraline turned the key in the door. It turned with a loud clunk. There was no brick wall on the other side of the door, only darkness. A cold wind blew through the passageway. Coraline made no move to walk through the door. "And he said that wasn't brave of him, doing that. Just standing there and being stung," said Coraline to the cat. "It wasn't brave because he wasn't scared. It was the only thing he could do. But going back again to get his glasses, when he knew the wasps were there, when he was really scared, that was brave." She took her first step down the dark corridor. She could smell dust and damp and mustiness. The cat padded along beside her. "And why was that?" asked the cat, although it sounded barely interested. "Because," she said, "when you're scared, but you still do it anyway. That's brave." The candle cast huge, strange, flickering shadows along the wall. She heard something moving in the darkness, beside her, or to one side of her, she could not tell. It seemed as if it was keeping pace with her, whatever it was. "And that's why you're going back to her world, then," said the cat. "Because your father once saved you from wasps?" "Don't be silly," said Coraline. "I'm going back for them because they are my parents. And if they noticed I was gone, I'm sure they would do the same for me. You know you're talking again." "How fortunate I am," said the cat, "in having a traveling companion of such wisdom and intelligence." Its tone remained sarcastic, but its fur was bristling, and its brush of a tail stuck up in the air. Coraline was going to say something like, "Sorry," or "Wasn't it a lot shorter walk last time?" when the candle went out suddenly, as if it had been snuffed by someone's hand. There was a scrabbling and a patting, and Coraline could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. She put out one hand and felt something wispy, like a spider's web, brush her hands and her face. At the end of the corridor, the electric light went on, blinding after the darkness. A woman stood, silhouetted by the light, a little ahead of Coraline. "Coraline! Darling!" she called. "Mom!" said Coraline, and she ran forward, eager and relieved. "Darling!" said the woman. "Why did you ever run away from me?" Coraline was too close to stop, and she felt the other mother's cold arms enfold her. She stood there, rigid and trembling, as the other mother held her tightly. "Where are my parents?" Coraline asked. "We're here," said her other mother in a voice so close to her real mother's that Coraline could scarcely tell them apart. "We're here. We're ready to love you and play with you and feed you and make your life interesting." Coraline pulled back, and the other mother let her go with reluctance. The other father, who had been sitting on a chair in the hallway, stood up and smiled. "Come on into the kitchen," he said. "I'll make us a midnight snack. And you'll want something to drink. Hot chocolate, perhaps?" Coraline walked down the hallway until she reached the mirror at the end. There was nothing reflected in it but a young girl in her dressing gown and slippers who looked like she had recently been crying, but whose eyes were real eyes, not black buttons, and who was holding tightly to a burned-out candle in a candlestick. She looked at the girl in the mirror, and the girl in the mirror looked back at her. I will be brave, thought Coraline. No. I am brave. She put down the candlestick on the floor, then turned around. The other mother and the other father were looking at her hungrily. I don't need a snack, she said. I have an apple. See? And she took an apple from her dressing gown pocket, then bit into it with relish and enthusiasm that she did not really feel. The other father looked disappointed. The other mother smiled, showing a full set of teeth. And each of the teeth was a tiny bit too long. The lights of the hallway made her black button eyes glitter and gleam. You don't frighten me, said Coraline, although they did frighten her very much. I want my parents back. The world seemed to shimmer a little at the edges. Whatever would I have done with your old parents? If they have left you, Coraline, it must be because they became bored with you or tired. Now I will never become bored with you, and I will never abandon you. You will always be safe here with me. The other mother's wet-looking black hair drifted around her head, like the tentacles of a creature in the deep ocean. They weren't bored of me, said Coraline. You're lying. You stole them. Silly, silly Coraline. They are fine wherever they are. Coraline simply glared at the other mother. I'll prove it, said the other mother, and brushed the surface of the mirror with her long, white fingers. It clouded over as if a dragon had breathed on it, and then it cleared. In the mirror it was daytime already. Coraline was looking at the hallway all the way down to her front door. The door opened from the outside, and Coraline's mother and father walked inside. They carried suitcases. That was a fine holiday, said Coraline's father. How nice it is not to have Coraline any more, said her mother with a happy smile. Now we can do all the things we wanted to do, like go abroad, but were prevented from doing by having a little daughter. And, said her father, I take great comfort in knowing that her other mother will take better care of her than we ever could. The mirror fogged and faded and reflected the night once more. See? Said her other mother. No, said Coraline, I don't see, and I don't believe it either. She hoped that what she had seen was not real, but she was not certain, not as certain as she sounded. There was a tiny doubt inside her, like a maggot in an apple core. Then she looked up and saw the expression on her mother's face, a flash of real anger which crossed her face like summer lightning, and Coraline was sure in her heart that what she had seen in the mirror was no more than an illusion. Coraline sat down on the sofa and ate her apple. Please, said her other mother, don't be difficult. She walked into the drawing room and clapped her hands twice. There was a rustling noise, and a black rat appeared. It stared up at her. Bring me the key, she said. The rat chittered, then ran through the open door, then led back to Coraline's own flat. The rat returned, dragging the key behind it. Why don't you have your own key on this side? Asked Coraline. There is only one key, only one door, said the other father. Hush, said the other mother. You must not bother our darling Coraline's head with such trivialities. She put the key in the keyhole and twisted. The lock was stiff, but it clunked closed. She dropped the key into her apron pocket. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten to a luminous gray. If we aren't going to have a midnight snack, said the other mother, we still need our beauty sleep. I'm going back to bed, Coraline. I would strongly suggest that you do the same. She placed her long white fingers on the shoulders of the other father, and she walked him out of the room. Coraline walked over to the door at the far corner of the drawing room. She tugged on it, but it was tightly locked. The door of her other parents' bedroom was now closed. She was indeed tired, but she did not want to sleep in the bedroom. She did not want to sleep under the same roof as her other mother. The door was not locked. Coraline walked out into the dawn and down the stone stairs. She sat down on the bottom step. It was cold. Something furry pushed itself against her side in one smooth, insinuating motion. Coraline jumped, then breathed a sigh of relief when she saw what it was. "Oh, it's you," she said to the black cat. "See," said the cat. "It wasn't so hard recognizing me, was it? Even without names." "Well, what if I wanted to call you?" The cat wrinkled its nose and managed to look unimpressed. "Calling cats," it confided, "tends to be a rather overrated activity. Might as well call a whirlwind." "What if it was dinner time?" asked Coraline. "Wouldn't you want to be called then?" "Of course," said the cat, "but a simple cry of 'dinner' would do nicely. See? No need for names." "Why does she want me?" Coraline asked the cat. "Why does she want me to stay here with her?" "She wants something to love, I think," said the cat. "Something that isn't her. She might want something to eat as well. It's hard to tell with creatures like that." "Do you have any advice?" asked Coraline. The cat looked as if it were about to say something else sarcastic. Then it flicked its whiskers and said, "Challenge her. There's no guarantee she'll play fair, but her kind of thing loves games and challenges." "What kind of thing is that?" asked Coraline. But the cat made no answer, simply stretched luxuriantly and walked away. Then it stopped and turned and said, "I'd go inside if I were you. Get some sleep. You have a long day ahead of you." And then the cat was gone. Still, Coraline realized it had a point. She crept back into the silent house, past the closed bedroom door, inside which the other mother and the other father— What? She wondered. Slept? Waited? And then it came to her that, should she open the bedroom door, she would find it empty, or more precisely, that it was an empty room, and it would remain empty until the exact moment that she opened the door. Somehow that made it easier. Coraline walked into the green and pink parody of her own bedroom. She closed the door and hauled the toy box in front of it. It would not keep anyone out, but the noise somebody would make trying to dislodge it would wake her, she hoped. The toys in the toy box were still mostly asleep, and they stirred and muttered as she moved their box, and then they went back to sleep. Coraline checked under her bed, looking for rats, but there was nothing there. She took off her dressing gown and slippers and climbed into bed and fell asleep with barely enough time to reflect, as she did so, on what the cat could have meant by a challenge. Coraline was woken by the mid-morning sun, full on her face. For a moment she felt utterly dislocated. She did not know where she was. She was not entirely sure who she was. It is astonishing just how much of what we are can be tied to the beds we wake up in the morning. And it is astonishing how fragile that can be. Sometimes Coraline would forget who she was while she was daydreaming, and that she was exploring the Arctic or the Amazon rainforest or darkest Africa. And it was not until someone tapped on her shoulder or said her name that Coraline would come back from 1,000,000 miles away with a start, and all in a fraction of a second have to remember who she was and what her name was and that she was even there at all. Now there was sun on her face, and she was Coraline Jones. Yes, and then the green and pinkness of the room she was in, and the rustling of a large painted paper butterfly as it fluttered and beat its way about the ceiling, told her where she had woken up. She climbed out of bed. She could not wear her pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers during the day, she decided, even if it meant wearing the other Coraline's clothes. Was there another Coraline? No, she realized. There wasn't. There was just her. There was no regular clothes in the cupboard, though. They were more like dressing-up clothes, or she thought, the kind of clothes she would love to have hanging in her own wardrobe at home. There was a Raggedy Witch costume, a patched scarecrow costume, a future warrior costume with little digital lights in it that glittered and blinked, a slinky evening dress all covered in feathers and mirrors. Finally, in a drawer, she found a pair of black jeans that seemed to be made of velvet night, and a gray sweater the color of thick smoke, with faint and tiny stars in the fabric which twinkled. She pulled on the jeans and the sweater. Then she put on a pair of bright orange boots she found at the bottom of the cupboard. She took her last apple out of the pocket of her dressing gown, and then took, from the same pocket, the stone with the hole in it. She put the stone into the pocket of her jeans, and it was as if her head had cleared a little, as if she had come out of some sort of fog. She went into the kitchen, but it was deserted. Still, she was sure that there was someone in the flat. She walked down the hall until she reached her father's study, and discovered that it was occupied. "Where's the other mother?" she asked the other father. He was sitting in the study at a desk which looked just like her father's, and he was not doing anything at all. Not even reading gardening catalogs as her own father did when he was only pretending to be working. "Out," he told her, fixing the doors. "There are some vermin problems." He seemed pleased to have someone to talk to. "The rats, you mean?" "No. The rats are our friends. This is the other kind, big black fellow, with this high tail." "The cat, you mean?" "That's the one," said her other father. He looked less like her true father today. There was something slightly vague about his face, like bread dough that had begun to rise, smoothing out the bumps and cracks and depressions. "Really, I mustn't talk to you when she's not here," he said. "But don't you worry. She won't be gone often. I shall demonstrate our tender hospitality to you, such that you will not even think about ever going back." He closed his mouth and folded his hands on his lap. "So what am I to do now?" asked Coraline. The other father pointed to his lips. Silence. "If you won't even talk to me," said Coraline, "I am going exploring." "No point," said the other father. "There isn't anywhere but here. This is all she made. The house, the grounds, and the people in the house. She made it, and she waited." Then he looked embarrassed, and he put one finger to his lips again, as if he had just said too much. Coraline walked out of his study. She went into the drawing room, over to the old door, and she pulled it, rattled it, and shook it. No, it was locked, fast, and the other mother had the key. She looked around the room. It was so familiar. That was what made it feel so truly strange. Everything was exactly the same as she remembered. There was all her grandmother's strange-smelling furniture. There was the painting of the bowl of fruit, a bunch of grapes, 2 plums, a peach, an apple, hanging on the wall. There was the low wooden table with the lion's feet and the empty fireplace, which seemed to suck heat from the room. But there was something else, something she did not remember seeing before. A ball of glass, up on the mantelpiece. She went over to the fireplace, went up on tiptoes and lifted it down. It was a snow globe, with 2 people in it. Coraline shook it and set the snow flying, white snow that glittered as it tumbled through the water. Then she put the snow globe back on the mantelpiece and carried on looking for her true parents and for a way out. She went out of the flat, past the flashing lights door, behind which the other Mrs. Spink and Forcible performed their show forever, and she set off into the woods. Where Coraline came from, once you were through the patch of trees, You saw nothing but the meadow and the old tennis courts. The woods went farther, the trees becoming cruder and less tree-like the further you went. Pretty soon they seemed very approximate, like the idea of trees, a grayish-brown trunk below, a greenish splodge of something that might have been leaves above. Coraline wondered if the other mother wasn't interested in trees, or if she just hadn't bothered with this bit properly, because nobody was expected to come out this far. She kept walking. And then the mist began. It was not damp like a normal fog or mist. It was not cold, and it was not warm. It felt to Coraline like she was walking into nothing. I'm an explorer, thought Coraline to herself, and I need all the ways out of here that I can get, so I shall keep walking. The world she was walking through was a pale nothingness, like a blank sheet of paper or an enormous empty white room. It had no temperature, no smell, no texture, and no taste. It certainly isn't a mist, thought Coraline, although she did not know what it was. For a moment she wondered if she might have gone blind, but no, she could see herself plain as day. But there was no ground beneath her feet, just a misty, milky whiteness. "And what do you think you're doing?" said a shape to one side of her. It took a few moments for her eyes to focus on it properly. She thought it might be some kind of lion at first, some distance away from her, and then she thought it might be a mouse close behind her, and then she knew what it was. "I'm exploring," Coraline told the cat. Its fur stood straight out from its body, and its eyes were wide, while its tail was down and between its legs. It did not look like a happy cat. "Bad place," said the cat, "if you want to call it a place, which I don't." "What are you doing here?" "I'm exploring." "Nothing to find here," said the cat. "This is just the outside, the part of the place she hasn't bothered to create." "She?" "The one who said she's your other mother," said the cat. "Who is she?" asked Coraline. The cat did not answer, just padded through the pale mist beside Coraline. A shape began to appear in front of them, something high and towering and dark. "You were wrong," she told the cat. "There is something here." And then it took shape in the mist, a dark house, which loomed at them out of the formless whiteness. "But that's," said Coraline. "The house you just left," agreed the cat. "Precisely." "Maybe I just turned around in the mist," said Coraline. The cat curled the high tip of its tail and tipped its head to one side. "You might have done," it said. "I certainly would not." "Wrong indeed." "But how can you walk away from something and still come back to it?" "Easy," said the cat. "Think of somebody walking around the world. You start out walking away from something and end up coming back to it." "Small world," said Coraline. "It's big enough for her," said the cat. "Spiders' webs only have to be large enough to catch flies." Coraline shivered. "He said that she's fixing all the gates and the doors," she told the cat. "To keep you out." "She may try," said the cat, unimpressed. "Oh, yes, she may try." They were standing under a clump of trees now beside the house. These trees looked much more likely. There's ways in and ways out of places like this that even she doesn't know about. "Did she make this place, then?" asked Coraline. "Made it, found it. What's the difference?" asked the cat. "Either way, she's had it a very long time. Hang on." And it gave a shiver and a leap, and before Coraline could blink, the cat was sitting with its paw holding down a big black rat. "It's not that I like rats at the best of times," said the cat, conversationally, as if nothing had happened, "but the rats in this place are all spies for her. She uses them as her She uses them as her eyes and hands. And with that, the cat let the rat go. It ran several feet, and then the cat, with one bound, was upon it, battling it hard with one sharpened, sharp-clawed paw, while with the other paw it held the rat down. "I love this bit," said the cat happily. "Want to see me do that again?" "No," said Coraline. "Why do you do it? You're torturing it." Said the cat. It let the rat go. The rat stumbled, dazed, for a few steps, then it began to run. With a blow of its paw, the cat knocked the rat into the air and caught it in its mouth. "Stop it!" said Coraline. The cat dropped the rat between its two front paws. "There are those," it said with a sigh in tones as smooth as oiled silk, "who have suggested that the tendency of a cat to play with its prey is a merciful one. After all, it permits the occasional funny little running snack to escape from time to time. How often does your dinner get to escape?" And then it picked the rat up in its mouth and carried it off into the woods behind a tree. Coraline walked back into the house. All was quiet and empty and deserted. Even her footsteps on the carpeted floor seemed loud. Dust motes hung in a beam of sunlight. At the far end of the hall was the mirror. She could see herself walking toward the mirror, looking reflected, a little braver than she actually felt. There was nothing else there in the mirror, just her, in the corridor. A hand touched her shoulder, and she looked up. The other mother stared down at Coraline with big, black button eyes. "Coraline, my darling," she said, "I thought we could play some games together this morning. Now you're back from your walk? Hopscotch? Happy families? Monopoly?" "You weren't in the mirror," said Coraline. The other mother smiled. "Mirrors," she said, "are never to be trusted. Now, what game shall we play?" Coraline shook her head. "I don't want to play with you," she said. "I want to go home and be with my real parents. I want you to let them go, to let us all go." The other mother shook her head very slowly. "Sharper than a serpent's tooth," she said, "is a daughter's ingratitude. Still, the proudest spirit can be broken with love," and her long white fingers waggled and caressed the air. "I have no plans to love you," said Coraline, "no matter what. You can't make me love you." "Let's talk about it," said the other mother, and she turned and walked into the lounge. Coraline followed her. The other mother sat down on the big sofa. She looked up a shopping bag. She picked up a shopping bag from beside the sofa and took out a white, rustling paper bag from inside it. "Would you like one?" She extended the hand with it to Coraline. Expecting it to be a toffee or a butterscotch ball, Coraline looked down. The bag was half filled with large, shiny, black beetles, crawling over each other in their efforts to get out of the bag. "No," said Coraline, "I don't want one." "Suit yourself," said her other mother. She carefully picked out a particularly large and black beetle, pulled off its legs, which she dropped neatly into a big glass ashtray on the small table beside the sofa, and popped the beetle into her mouth. She crunched it happily. "Yum," she said, and took another. "You're sick," said Coraline. "Sick and evil and weird." "Is that any way to talk to your mother?" her other mother asked, with her mouth full of black beetles. "You aren't my mother," said Coraline. Her other mother ignored this. "Now, I think you are a little overexcited, Coraline. Perhaps this afternoon we could do a little embroidery together or some watercolor painting. Then dinner, and then, if you have been good, you may play with the rats a little before bed, and I shall read you a story and tuck you in and kiss you good night. Her long white fingers fluttered gently, like a tired butterfly, and Coraline shivered. "No," said Coraline. The other mother sat on the sofa. Her mouth was set in a line. Her lips were pursed. She popped another black beetle into her mouth and then another, like someone with a bag of chocolate-covered raisins. Her big black button eyes stared into Coraline's hazel eyes. Her shiny black hair twined and twisted about her neck and shoulders as if it were blowing in some wind that Coraline could not touch or feel. They stared at each other for over a minute. Then the other mother said, "Manners!" She folded the white paper bag carefully so no black beetles could escape, and she placed it back in the shopping bag. Then she stood up, and up, and up, and she seemed taller than Coraline remembered. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out, first the black door key, which she frowned at and tossed into her shopping bag, then a tiny silver-colored key. She held it up triumphantly. "There we are," she said. "This is for you, Coraline, for your own good, because I love you, to teach you manners. Manners maketh man after all." She pulled Coraline back into the hallway and advanced upon the mirror at the end of the hall. Then she pushed the tiny key into the fabric of the mirror and she twisted it. It opened like a door, revealing a dark space behind it. "You may come out when you've learned some manners," said the other mother, "and when you're ready to be a loving daughter." She picked Coraline up and pushed her into the dim space behind the mirror. A fragment of beetle was sticking to her lower lip, and there was no expression at all in her black button eyes. Then she swung the mirror door closed and left Coraline in darkness. Somewhere inside her, Coraline could feel a huge sob welling up, and then she stopped it before it came out. She took a deep breath and let it go. She put out her hands to touch the space in which she was imprisoned. It was the size of a broom closet, tall enough to stand in or to sit in, not wide or deep enough to lie down in. One wall was glass, and it felt cold to the touch. She went around the tiny room a second time, running her hands over every surface that she could reach, feeling for doorknobs or switches or concealed catches, some kind of way out, and found nothing. A spider scuttled over the back of her hand, and she choked back a shriek. But apart from the spider, she was alone in the closet in the pitch dark. And then her hand touched something that felt, for all the world, like somebody's cheek and lips, small and cold. A voice whispered in her ear, "Hush and shush. Say nothing, for the beldam might be listening." Coraline said nothing. She felt a cold hand touch her face, fingers running over it like the gentle beat of a moth's wings. Another voice, hesitant and so faint, Coraline wondered if she were imagining it, and said, art thou alive?" "Yes," whispered Coraline. "Poor child," said the first voice. "Who are you?" whispered Coraline. "Names, names, names," said another voice, all far away and lost. "The names are the first things to go, after the breath has gone, and the beating of the heart. We keep our memories longer than our names. I still keep pictures in my mind of my governess on some May morning, carrying my hoop and stick, and the morning sun behind her and all the tulips bobbing in the breeze. But I have forgotten the name of my governess, and of the tulips too." "I don't think tulips have names," said Coraline. "They're just tulips." "Perhaps," said the voice sadly, "but I have always thought that these tulips must have names. They were red and orange and red and red and orange and yellow, like the embers in the nursery fire of a winter's evening. I remember them." The voice sounded so sad that Coraline put out a hand to the place where the voice was coming from, and she found a cold hand, and she squeezed it tightly. Her eyes were beginning to get used to the darkness. Now Coraline saw, or imagined she saw, 3 shapes, each as faint and pale as the moon in the daytime sky. They were the shapes of children about her size. The cold hand squeezed her hand back. "Thank you," said the voice. "Are you a girl?" asked Coraline, "or a boy?" There was a pause. "When I was small, I wore skirts and my hair was long and curled," it said doubtfully. "But now that you ask, it does seem to me that one day they took my skirts and gave me breeches and cut my hair." "'Tain't something we give a mind to," said the first of the voices. "A boy, perhaps, then," continued the one whose hand she was holding. "I believe I was a boy." And it glowed a little more brightly in the darkness of the room behind the mirror. "What happened to you all?" asked Coraline. "How did you come here?" "She left us here," said one of the voices. "She stole our hearts, and she stole our souls, and she took our lives away. And she left us here, and she forgot about us in the dark." "You poor things," said Coraline. "How long have you been here?" "So very long a time," said a voice. "Aye, time beyond reckoning," said another voice. "I walked through the scullery door," said the voice of the one that thought it might be a boy, "and I found myself back in the parlor. But she was waiting for me. She told me she was my other mamma, but I never saw my true mamma again." "Flee!" said the very first voices. Another girl, Coraline fancied. "Flee while there's still air in your lungs, and blood in your veins, and warmth in your heart. Flee while you still have your mind and your soul." "I'm not running away," said Coraline. "She has my parents. I came to get them back." "Ah, but she'll keep you here while the days turn to dust, and the leaves fall, and the years pass one after the next, like the tick, tick, ticking of a clock." "No," said Coraline, "she won't." There was silence then in the room behind the mirror. "Peradventure," said a voice in the darkness, "if you could win your mamma and your papa back from the beldam, you could also win free our souls." "Has she taken them?" asked Coraline, shocked. "Aye, and hidden them. That is why we could not leave here. When we died, she kept us and she fed on us until now we've got nothing left of ourselves, only snake skins and spider husks. Find our secret hearts, young mistress." "And what will happen to you if I do?" asked Coraline. The voices said nothing. "And what is she going to do to me?" she said. The pale fingers pulsed faintly. She could imagine that they were nothing more than after-images, like the glow left by a bright light in your eyes after the lights go out. "It doth not hurt," whispered one faint voice. "She will take your life and all you are and all you carest for, and she will leave you with nothing but mist and fog. She'll take your joy, and one day you'll awake and your heart and your soul will have gone. A husk you'll be, a wisp you'll be, and a thing no more than a dream on waking, or a memory of something forgotten." "Hollow," whispered the third voice. "Hollow, hollow, 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 hollow." "You must flee," sighed a voice faintly. "I don't think so," said Coraline. "I tried running away, and it didn't work. She just took my parents. Can you tell me how to get out of this room?" "If we knew, then we would tell you." "Poor things," said Coraline to herself. She sat down. She took off her sweater and rolled it up and put it behind her head as a pillow. "She won't keep me in the dark forever," said Coraline. "She brought me here to play games. Games and challenges. the cat said. I'm not much of a challenge here in the dark. She tried to get comfortable, twisting and bending herself to fit the cramped space behind the mirror. Her stomach rumbled. She ate her last apple, taking the tiniest bites, making it last as long as she could. When she had finished, she was still hungry. Then an idea struck her, and she whispered, "When she comes to let me out, why don't you three come with me?" "We wish that we could," they sighed to her in their barely there voices, "but she has our hearts in her keeping. Now, we belong to the dark and to the empty places. The light would shrivel us and burn." "Oh," said Coraline. She closed her eyes, which made the darkness darker, and she rested her head on the rolled-up sweater, and she went to sleep. And as she fell asleep, she thought she felt a ghost kiss her cheek, tenderly, and a small voice whisper into her ear, a voice so faint it was barely there at all, a gentle, wispy nothing of a voice so hushed that Coraline could almost believe she was imagining it. "Look through the stone," it said to her. And then she slept. The other mother looked healthier than before. There was a little blush to her cheeks, and her hair was wriggling like lazy snakes on a warm day. Her black button eyes seemed as if they had been freshly polished. She had pushed through the mirror as if she were walking through nothing more solid than water, and had stared down at Coraline. Then she had opened the door with the little silver key. She picked Coraline up, just as Coraline's real mother had when Coraline was much younger, cradling the half-sleeping child as if she were a baby. The other mother carried Coraline into the kitchen and put her down very gently upon the countertop. Coraline struggled to wake herself up, conscious only for the moment of having been cuddled and loved and wanting more of it, then realizing where she was and who she was with. "There, my sweet Coraline," said her other mother. "I came and fetched you out of the cupboard. You needed to be taught a lesson, but we temper our justice with mercy here. We love the sinner and we hate the sin. Now, if you will be a good child who loves her mother, be compliant and fair-spoken, you and I shall understand each other perfectly, and we shall love each other perfectly as well." Coraline scratched the sleep grit from her eyes. There were other children in there, she said. Old ones from a long time ago. "Were there?" said the other mother. She was bustling between the pans and the fridge, bringing out eggs and cheeses, butter, and a slab of sliced pink bacon. "Yes," said Coraline. "There were. I think you're planning to turn me into one of them. A dead shell." Her other mother smiled gently, with one hand. She cracked the eggs into a bowl. With the other, she whisked them and whirled them. Then she dropped a pat of butter into the frying pan, where it hissed and fizzled and spun as she sliced thin slices of cheese. She poured the melted butter and the cheese into the egg mixture and whisked it some more. "Now I think you're being silly, dear," said the other mother. "I love you. I will always love you. Nobody sensible believes in ghosts anyway. That's because they're all such liars. Smell the lovely breakfast I'm making for you." She poured the yellow mixture into the pan. "Cheese omelet, your favorite." Coraline's mouth watered. "You like games," she said. "That's what I've been told." The other mother's black eyes flashed. "Everybody likes games," she said. "Yes," said Coraline. She climbed down from the counter and sat at the table. The bacon was sizzling and spitting under the grill. It smelled wonderful. "Wouldn't you be happier if you won me, fair and square?" asked Coraline. "Possibly," said the other mother. She had a show of unconcernedness, but her fingers twitched and drummed, and she licked her lips with her scarlet tongue. "What exactly are you offering?" "Me," said Coraline, and she gripped her knees under the table to stop them from shaking. "If I lose, I'll stay here with you forever, and I'll let you love me. I'll be a most dutiful daughter. I'll eat your food and play happy families, and I'll let you sew your buttons into my eyes." Her other mother stared at her, black buttons unblinking. "That sounds very fine," she said. "And if you do not lose?" "Then you let me go. You let everyone go. My real father and mother, the dead children, everyone you've trapped here." The other mother took the bacon from under the grill and put it on a plate. Then she slipped the cheese omelet from the pan onto the plate, flipping it as she did so, letting it fold itself into a perfect omelet shape. She placed the breakfast plate in front of Coraline, along with a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice and a mug of frothy hot chocolate. "Yes," she said, "I think I like this game. But what kind of game shall it be? A riddle game? A test of knowledge or of skill?" "An exploring game," suggested Coraline. "A finding things game." "And what is it you think you should be finding in this hide-and-go-seek game, Coraline Jones?" Coraline hesitated. Then, "My parents," said Coraline, "and the souls of the children behind the mirror." The other mother smiled at this triumphantly, and Coraline wondered if she had made the right choice. Still, it was too late to change her mind now. "A deal," said the other mother. "Now eat up. Eat up your breakfast, my sweet. Don't worry, it won't hurt you." Coraline stared at the breakfast, hating herself for giving in so easily, but she was starving. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" asked Coraline. "Swear it." "I swear it," said the other mother. "I swear it on my own mother's grave." "Does she have a grave?" asked Coraline. "Oh, yes," said the other mother. "I put her in there myself, and when I found her trying to crawl out, I put her back in." "Swear on something else so I can trust you to keep your word." "My right hand," said the other mother, holding it up. She waggled the long fingers slowly, displaying the claw-like nails. "I swear on that." Coraline shrugged. "Okay," she said. "It's a deal." She ate the breakfast, trying not to wolf it down. She was hungrier than she had thought. As she ate, her other mother stared at her. It was hard to read expressions into those black button eyes, but Coraline thought that her other mother looked hungry too. She drank the orange juice, but even though she knew she would like it, she could not bring herself to taste the hot chocolate. "Where should I start looking?" asked Coraline. "Where you wish," said her other mother, as if she did not care at all. Coraline looked at her, and Coraline thought hard. There was no point, she decided, in exploring the garden and the grounds. They didn't exist. They weren't real. There was no abandoned tennis court in the other mother's world, no bottomless well. And that was real, was the house itself. All that was real. She looked around the kitchen. She opened the oven, peered into the freezer, poked into the salad compartment of the fridge. The other mother followed her about, looking at Coraline with a smirk, always hovering at the edge of her lips. "How big are the souls anyway?" asked Coraline. The other mother sat down at the kitchen table and leaned back against the wall, saying nothing. She picked at her teeth with a long, crimson, varnished fingernail. Then she tapped her finger gently. Tap, tap, tap against the polished, black surface of her black button eyes. "Fine," said Coraline. "Don't tell me. I don't care. It doesn't matter if you help me or not. Everyone knows that a soul is the same size as a beach ball." She was hoping the other mother would say something like, "Nonsense! They're the size of ripe onions!" or grandfather clocks or suitcases. But the other mother simply smiled, and the tap, tap, tapping of her fingernail against her eye was as steady and relentless as the drip of water droplets from the faucet into the sink. And then Coraline realized it was simply the noise of the water, and she was alone in the room. Coraline shivered. She preferred the other mother to have a location. If she were nowhere, then she could be anywhere. And after all, it is always easier to be afraid of something you cannot see. She put her hands into her pockets and her fingers closed around the reassuring shape of the stone with the hole in it. She pulled it out of her pocket, held it in front of her as if she were holding a gun, and walked out into the hall. There was no sound but the tap-tap of the water dripping into the metal sink. She glanced at the mirror at the end of the hall. For a moment it clouded over, and it seemed to her that faces swam in the glass, indistinct and shapeless, and then the faces were gone, and there was nothing in the mirror but a girl who was small for her age, holding something that glowed gently like a green coal. Coraline looked down at her hand, surprised. It was just a stone with a hole in it, a nondescript brown pebble. Then she looked back into the mirror where the stone glimmered like an emerald. A trail of green fire blew from the pebble in the mirror and drifted toward Coraline's bedroom. Said Coraline. She walked into the bedroom. The toys fluttered excitedly as she walked in, as if they were pleased to see her, and a little tank rolled out of the toy box to greet her. Its tread rolling over several other toys. It fell from the toy box onto the floor, tripping as it fell, and it lay on the carpet like a beetle on its back, grumbling and grinding its treads over Coraline. Before Coraline picked it up and turned it over, the tank fled under the bed in embarrassment. Coraline looked around the room. She looked in the cupboards and the drawers. She then picked up one end of the toy box and tipped all the toys in it out onto the carpet, where they grumbled and stretched and wiggled awkwardly, free of each other. A gray marble rolled across the floor and clicked against the wall. None of the toys looked particularly soul-like, she thought. She picked up and examined a silver charm bracelet from which hung tiny animal charms that chased each other around the perimeter of the bracelet. The fox never catching the rabbit, the bear never gaining on the fox. Coraline opened her hand and looked at the stone with the hole in it, hoping for a clue, but not finding one. Most of the toys that had been in the toy box had now crawled away to hide under the bed, and the few toys that were left, a green plastic soldier, the glass marble, a vivid pink yo-yo, and such, were the kind of things you find in the bottom of toy boxes in the real world. Forgotten objects, abandoned and unloved. She was about to leave and look elsewhere, and then she remembered a voice in the darkness, a gentle whispering voice, and what it had told her to do. She raised the stone with a hole in it and held it in front of her right eye. She closed her left eye and looked at the room through the hole in the stone. Through the stone, the world was gray and colorless like a pencil drawing. Everything in it was gray. No, not quite everything. Something glinted on the floor, something the color of an ember in a nursery fireplace, the color of a scarlet and orange tulip, nodding in the May sun. Coraline reached out her left hand, scared that if she took her eye off it, it would vanish, and she fumbled for the burning thing. Her fingers closed about something smooth and cool. She snatched it up and then lowered the stone with a hole in it from her eye and looked down. The gray glass marble from the bottom of the toy box sat dully in the pink palm of her hand. She raised the stone to her eye once more and looked through it at the marble. Once again the marble burned and flickered with a red fire. A voice whispered in her mind, "Indeed, lady, it comes to me that I certainly was a boy. Now I do think on it. Oh, but you must hurry. There are 2 of us still to find, and the beldam is already angry with you for uncovering me." "If I'm going to do this," thought Coraline, "I'm not going to do it in her clothes." She changed back into her pajamas and her dressing gown and in her slippers, leaving the gray sweater and the black jeans neatly folded on the bed, and the orange boots on the floor by the toy box. She put the marble into her dressing gown pocket and walked out into the hall. Something stung her face and hands like sand blowing on a beach on a windy day. She covered her eyes and pushed forward. The sand stings got worse, and it got harder and harder to walk, as if she was pushing into the wind on a particularly blustery day. It was a vicious wind and a cold one. She took a step backwards, the way she had come. "Okay, I'm going to take a very quick break because my computer is dying. So if you just give me 1 second." I was actually planning on not finishing today, but it seems like it is very likely that I will. So if you want to stick around, I'm just going to plug in my computer, which is something I should have done beforehand. 1 second. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Okay, we're almost done with the story. All right. She took a step backwards, the way she had come. "Oh, keep going," whispered a ghost voice in her ear, "for the beldam is angry." She stepped forward in the hallway into another gust of wind, which stung her cheeks and face with invisible sand, sharp as needles, sharp as glass. "Play fair," shouted Coraline into the wind. There was no reply, but the wind whipped about her one more time, petulantly, and then it dropped away and it was gone. As she passed the kitchen, Coraline could hear in the sudden silence the drip, drip of the water from the leaking tap, or perhaps the other mother's long fingernails tapping impatiently against the table. Coraline resisted the urge to look. In a couple of strides, she reached the front door, and she walked outside. Coraline went down the steps and around the house until she reached the other Miss Spink and Miss Forcible's flat. The lamps around the floor were flickering on and off almost randomly now, spelling out no words that Coraline could understand. The door was closed. She was afraid it was locked, and she pushed on it with all her strength. First it stuck, then suddenly it gave, and with a jerk, Coraline stumbled into the dark room beyond. Coraline closed one hand around the stone with the hole in it and walked forward into blackness. She expected to find a curtained anteroom, but there was nothing there. The room was dark. The theater was empty. She moved ahead cautiously. Something rustled above her. She looked up into a deeper darkness, and as she did so, her feet knocked against something. She reached down, picked up a flashlight, and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the room. The theater was derelict and abandoned. Chairs were broken on the floor, and old, dusty spiderwebs draped the walls and hung from the rotten wood and the decomposing velvet hangings. Something rustled once again. Coraline directed her light beam upward toward the ceiling. There were things up there, hairless, jellyish. She thought they might once have had faces, might even once have been dogs, but no dogs had wings like bats, or could hang like spiders, like bats, upside down. The light startled the creatures, and one of them took to the air, its wings whirring heavily through the dust. Coraline ducked as it swooped close to her. It came to rest on a far wall, and it began to clamber, upside down, back to the nest of the dog bats upon the ceiling. Coraline raised the stone to her eye, and she scanned the room, looking through it, looking for something that glowed or glinted, a telltale sign that somewhere in this room was another hidden soul. She ran the beam of the flashlight about the room, as she searched, the thick dust in the air making the light beam seem almost solid. There was something up on the back wall behind the ruined stage. It was grayish-white, twice the size of Coraline herself, and it was stuck to the back wall like a slug. Coraline took a deep breath. "I'm not afraid," she told herself. "I'm not." She did not believe herself, but she scrambled up onto the stage, fingers sinking into the rotting wood as she pulled herself up. As she got closer to the thing on the wall, she saw that it was some kind of sack, like a spider's egg case. It twitched in the light beam. Inside the sack was something that looked like a person, but a person with 2 heads, with twice as many arms and legs as it should have. The creature in the sack seemed horribly unformed and unfinished, as if 2 plastic people had been warmed and rolled together, squashed and pressed into one thing. Coraline hesitated. She did not want to approach the thing. The dog bats dropped one by one from the ceiling and began to circle the room, coming close to her but never touching her. Perhaps there are no souls hidden here, she thought. Perhaps I can just leave and go somewhere else. She took a last look through the hole in the stone. The abandoned theater was still a bleak gray, but now there was a brown glow as rich and bright as polished cherry wood coming from inside the sack. Whatever was glowing was being held in one of the hands of the thing on the wall. Coraline walked across, slowly across the damp stage, trying to make as little noise as she could, afraid that if she disturbed the thing in the sack, it would open its eyes and see her, and then... But there was nothing that she could think of as scary as having it look at her. Her heart pounding in her chest, she took another step forward. She had never been so scared, but still she walked forward until she reached the sack. Then she pushed her hand into the sticky, clinging whiteness of the stuff on the wall. It cracked softly like a tiny fire as she pushed, and it clung to her skin and closed like a spiderweb clings, like white cotton candy. She pushed her hand into it and reached upward until she touched a cold hand, which was, she could feel, closed around another glass marble. The creature's skin felt slippery as if it had been covered in jelly. Coraline tugged at the marble. At first nothing happened. It was held tight in the creature's grasp. Then, one by one, the fingers loosened their grip and the marble slipped into her hand. She pulled her arm back through the sticky webbing, relieved that the thing's eyes had not opened. She shone the light on its faces. They resembled, she decided, the younger versions of Miss Spink and Miss Forcible, but twisted and squeezed together like 2 lumps of wax that had melted and melded together into one ghastly thing. Without warning, one of the creature's hands made a grab for Coraline's arm. Its fingernails scraped her skin, but it was too slippery to grip, and Coraline pulled away successfully, and then the eyes opened, 4 black buttons glinting and staring down at her, and 2 voices that sounded like no voice that Coraline had ever heard began to speak to her. One of them wailed and whispered. The other buzzed like a fat and angry blue bottle at a window pane. But the voices said as one person, "Thief, give it back. Stop. Thief." The air became alive with dog bats. Coraline began to back away. She realized that then, terrifying though the thing on the wall that had once been the other Mrs. and Spink and Forcible was, it was attached to the wall by its web, encased in its cocoon. It could not follow her. The dog bats flapped and fluttered about her, but they did nothing to hurt Coraline. She climbed down from the stage, shone the flashlight about the old theater, looking for a way out. "Flee, miss," wailed a girl's voice in her head. "Flee now. You have 2 of us. Flee this place while your blood still flows." Coraline dropped the marble into her pocket beside the other. She spotted the door, ran to it, and pulled on it until it opened. Outside, the world had become formless, swirling mist with no shapes or shadows behind it, while the house itself seemed to have twisted and stretched. It seemed to Coraline that it was crouching and staring down at her as if it were not really a house but only the idea of a house. And the person who had the idea, she was certain, was not a good person. There was a sticky web stuff clinging to her arm, and she wiped it off as best as she could. The gray windows of the house slanted at strange angles. The other mother was waiting for her, standing on the grass with her arms folded. Her black button eyes were expressionless, but her lips were pressed tightly together in a cold fury. When she saw Coraline, she reached out one long white hand, and she crooked a finger. Coraline walked toward her. The other mother said nothing. "I got 2, said Coraline. "One soul still to go." The expression on the other mother's face did not change. She might not have heard what Coraline said. "Well, I just thought you'd want to know," said Coraline. "Thank you, Coraline," said the other mother coldly, and her voice did not just come from her mouth, it came from the mist, the fog, and the house and the sky. She said, "You know that I love you." And despite herself, Coraline nodded. It was true. The other mother loved her. But she loved Coraline as a miser loves money, or a dragon loves its gold. In the other mother's button eyes, Coraline knew that she was a possession, nothing more. A tolerated pet whose behavior was no longer amusing. "I don't want your love," said Coraline. "I don't want anything from you." "Not even a helping hand?" asked the other mother. "You have been doing so well after all. I thought you might want a little hint to help you with the rest of your treasure hunt." "I'm doing fine on my own," said Coraline. "Yes," said the other mother, "but if you wanted to get into the flat in the front, the empty one, to look around, you would find the door locked, and then where would you be?" "Oh." Coraline pondered this for a moment, then she said, "Is there a key?" The other mother stood there in the paper-gray fog of the flattening world. Her black hair drifted about her head as if it had a mind and a purpose all of its own. She coughed suddenly in the back of her throat, and then she opened her mouth. The other mother reached up her hand and removed a small brass front door key from her tongue. "Here," she said. "You'll need this to get in." She tossed the key casually toward Coraline, who caught it one-handed before she could think about whether she wanted it or not. The key was still slightly damp. A chill wind blew about them, and Coraline shivered and looked away. Then she looked back. She was alone. Uncertainly, she walked around to the front of the house and stood in front of the door to the empty flat. Like all the doors, it was painted bright green. "She does not mean well," whispered a ghost voice in her ear. "You do not believe that she would help you. It must be a trick." Coraline said, "Yes, you're right, I expect." Then she put the key in the lock and turned it. Silently, the door swung open, and silently, Coraline walked inside. The flat had walls the color of old milk. The wooden boards of the floor were uncarpeted and dusty with the marks and patterns of old carpets and rugs on them. There was no furniture in there, or only places where furniture had once been. Nothing decorated the walls. There were discolored rectangles on the walls to show where paintings or photographs had once hung. It was so silent that Coraline imagined that she could hear the motes of dust drifting through the air. She found herself to be quite worried that something would jump out at her, so she began to whistle. She thought it might make it harder for things to jump out at her if she was whistling. First, she walked through the empty kitchen. Then she walked through an empty bathroom containing only a cast-iron bath, and in the bath a dead spider the size of a small cat. The last room she looked at had, she supposed, once been a bedroom. She could imagine that the rectangular dust shadow on the floorboards had once been a bed. Then she saw something, and smiled grimly, setting into the floorboards. Then she saw something and smiled grimly. Set into the floorboards was a large metal ring. Coraline knelt and took the cold ring in her hands, and she tugged upward as hard as she could. Terribly slowly, stiffly, heavily, a hinged square of floor lifted. It was a trap door. It lifted, and through the opening Coraline could see only darkness. She reached down, and her hand found a cold switch. She flicked it without much hope that it would work, but somewhere below her, a bulb lit, and a thin yellow light came up from the hole in the floor. She could see steps heading down, but nothing else. Coraline put her hand into her pocket and took out the stone with the hole in it. She looked through it at the cellar, but saw nothing. She put the stone back in her pocket. Up through the hole came the smell of damp clay and something else. A tang like sour vinegar. Coraline let herself down into the hole, looking nervously at the trap door. It was so heavy that if it fell, she was sure she would be trapped down in the darkness forever. She put up a hand and touched it, but it stayed in position, and then she turned toward the darkness below, and she walked down the steps. Set into the wall at the bottom of the steps was another light switch, metal and rusting. She pushed it until it clicked down, and a naked bulb hanging from a wire from the low ceiling came on. It did not give up enough light, even for Coraline to make out the things that had been painted onto the flaking cellar walls. The paintings seemed crude. There were eyes, she could see that, and things that might have been grapes, and other things below them. Coraline could not be sure that they were paintings of people. There was a pile of rubbish in one corner of the room, cardboard boxes filled with mildewed papers and decaying curtains in a heap beside them. Coraline's slippers crunched across the cement floor. The bad smell was worse now. She was ready to turn and leave when she saw the floor sticking out from beneath the pile of curtains. She took a deep breath. The smell of sour wine and moldy bread filled her head, and she pulled away the damp cloth to reveal something more or less the size and shape of a person. In that dim light, it took her several seconds to recognize it for what it was. The thing was pale and swollen like a grub, with thin, stick-like arms and feet. It had almost no features on its face, which had puffed and swollen like risen bread dough. The thing had 2 large black buttons where its eyes should have been. Coraline made a noise, a sound of revulsion and horror, and as if it had heard her and awakened, the thing began to sit up. Coraline stood there frozen. The thing turned its head until both its black button eyes were pointed straight at her. A mouth opened in the mouthless face, strands of pale stuff sticking to the lips, and a voice that no longer even faintly resembled her father's whispered, "Coraline." "Well," said Coraline to the thing that had once been her other father, "at least you didn't jump out at me." The creature's twig-like hands moved to its face and pushed the pale clay about, making something like a noise. It said nothing. "I'm looking for my parents," said Coraline, "or a stolen soul from one of the other children. Are they down here?" "There is nothing down here," said the pale thing indistinctly. "Nothing but dust and damp and forgetting." The thing was white and huge and swollen. Monstrous, thought Coraline, but also miserable. She raised the stone with the hole in it to her eye and looked through it. Nothing. The pale thing was telling her the truth. "Poor thing," she said. "I bet she made you come down here as a punishment for telling me too much." The thing hesitated. Then it nodded. Coraline wondered how she could ever have imagined that this grub-like thing resembled her father. "I'm so sorry," she said. "She's not best pleased," said the thing that was once the other father. "Not best pleased at all. You've put her quite out of sorts, and when she gets out of sorts, she takes it out on everybody else. It's her way." Coraline patted his hairless head. Its skin was tacky like warm bread dough. "Poor thing," she said. "You're just a thing she made and then threw away." The thing nodded vigorously, and as it nodded, the left button eye fell off and clattered onto the concrete floor. The thing looked around vacantly with its one eye as if it had lost her. Finally it saw her, and, as if making a great effort, it opened its mouth once more and said in a wet, urgent voice, "Run, child. Leave this place. She wants me to hurt you, to keep you here forever so that you can never finish the game, and she will win. She is pushing me so hard to hurt you, I cannot fight her." "You can," said Coraline. "Be brave." She looked around. The thing that had once been the other father was between her and the steps, up and out of the cellar. She started edging along the wall, heading toward the steps. The thing twisted bonelessly until its one eye was facing her. It seemed to be getting bigger now and more awake. "Alas," it said, "I cannot." And it lunged across the cellar toward her then, its toothless mouth open wide. Coraline had a single heartbeat in which to react. She could only think of two things to do. Either she could scream and try to run away and be chased around a badly lit cellar by the huge grub thing, be chased until it caught her, or she could do something else. So she did something else. As the thing reached her, Coraline put out her hand and closed it around the thing's remaining button eye, and she tugged as hard as she knew how. For a moment nothing happened. Then the button came away and flew from her hand, clicking against the walls before it fell to the cellar floor. The thing froze in place. It threw its pale head back blindly and opened its mouth horribly wide, and it roared its anger and frustration. Then, all in a rush, the thing swept toward the place where Coraline had been standing. But Coraline was not standing there any longer. She was already tiptoeing as quietly as she could up the steps that would take her away from the dim cellar with the crude paintings on the wall. She could not take her eyes from the floor beneath her, though, across which the pale thing flopped and writhed, hunting for her. Then, as if it was being told what to do, the creature stopped moving, and its blind head tipped to one side. "It's listening for me," thought Coraline. "I must be extra quiet." She took another step up, and her foot slipped on the step, and the thing heard her. Its head tipped toward her. For a moment it swayed and seemed to be gathering its wits. Then, fast as a serpent, it slithered for the steps and began to flow up them toward her. Coraline turned and ran wildly up the last half-dozen steps, and she pushed herself up and onto the floor of the dusty bedroom. Without pausing, she pulled the heavy trapdoor toward her and let go of it. It crashed down with a thump, just as something large banged against it. The trapdoor shook and rattled in the floor, but it stayed where it was. Coraline took a deep breath, as if there had been any furniture in the flat, even a chair. She would have pulled it onto the trap door, but there was nothing. She walked out of that flat as fast as she could, without actually ever running, and she locked the front door behind her. She left the door key under the mat, then she walked down onto the drive. She had half expected that the other mother would be standing there waiting for Coraline to come out, but the world was silent and empty. Coraline wanted to go home. She hugged herself and told herself that she was brave, and she almost believed herself, and then she walked around to the side of the house in the gray mist that wasn't a mist, and she made for the stairs to go up. Coraline walked up the stairs outside the building to the topmost flat where, in her world, the crazy old man upstairs lived. She had gone up there once with her real mother, when her mother was collecting for charity. They had stood in the open doorway waiting for the crazy old man with the big mustache to find the envelope that Coraline's mother had left. And the flat had smelled of strange foods and pipe tobacco and odd, sharp, cheesy smelling things that Coraline could not name. She had not wanted to go any farther inside than that. "I'm an explorer," said Coraline out loud, but her words sounded muffled and dead on the misty air. She had made it out of the cellar, hadn't she? And she had, but there was one thing that Coraline was certain of. It was that this flat would be worse. She reached the top of the house, the topmost flat that had once been the attic of the house, but that was long ago. She knocked on the green-painted door. It swung open, and she walked in. "We have eyes, and we have nerves. We have tails, we have teeth. You'll all get what you deserves when we rise from the underneath," whispered a dozen or more tiny voices in that dark flat with the roof so low where it met the walls that Coraline could almost reach and touch it. Red eyes stared at her. Little pink feet scurried away as she came close. Darker shadows slipped through the shadows at the edges of things. It smelled much worse in here than in the real crazy old man's upstairs flat. That smelled of food, unpleasant food to Coraline's mind, but she knew that was a matter of taste. She did not like spices, herbs, or exotic things. This place smelled as if all the exotic foods in the world had been left out to go rotten. "Little girl," said a rustling voice in a far room. "Yes," said Coraline. "I'm not frightened," she told herself, and as she thought it, she knew that it was true. There was nothing here that frightened her. These things, even the thing in the cellar, were illusions, and things made by the other mother in a ghastly parody of the real people and real things on the other end of the corridor. She could not truly make anything, decided Coraline. She could only twist and copy and distort things that already existed. And then Coraline found herself wondering why the other mother would have placed a snow globe on the drawing-room mantelpiece, for the mantelpiece in Coraline's world was quite bare. As soon as she had asked herself the question, she realized that there was actually an answer. Then the voice came again, and her train of thought was interrupted. "Come here, little girl. I know what you want, little girl." It was a rustling voice, scratchy and dry. It made Coraline think of some kind of enormous dead insect. Which was silly, she knew. How could a dead thing, especially a dead insect, have a... She walked through several rooms with low, slanting ceilings until she came to the final room. It was a bedroom, and the other crazy old man upstairs sat at the far end of the room, in the darkness, bundled up in his coat and hat. As Coraline entered, he began to talk. "Nothing's changed, little girl. he said, his voice sounding like the noise dry leaves make as they rustle across a pavement. And what if you do everything you swore you would? What then? Nothing's changed. You'll go home, you'll be bored, you'll be ignored. No one will listen to you. No, not really listen to you. You're too clever and too quiet for them to understand. They don't even get your name right. Stay here with us, said the voice from the figure at the end of the room. We will listen to you and play with you and laugh with you. Your other mother will build whole worlds for you to explore and tear them down every night when you are done. Every day will be better and brighter than the one that went before. From a toy box, how much better would a world be built just like that, and all for you? And will there be gray, wet days where I just don't know what to do and there's nothing to read or to watch and nowhere to go? And the day, Dr. Forever? Asked Coraline. From the shadows, the man said, Never. And will there be awful meals with food from recipes with garlic and tarragon and beans in it? Asked Coraline. Every meal will be a thing of joy, whispered the voice from under the old man's hat. Nothing will pass your lips that does not entirely delight you. And could I have day-glow green hair and yellow Wellington boots in the shape of frogs? Asked Coraline. Frogs, ducks, rhinos, octopuses, whatever you desire. The world will be new for every morning. For you. If you stay here, you can have whatever you want. Coraline sighed. You don't really understand, do you? She said. I don't want whatever I want. Nobody does, not really. What kind of fun would it be if I just got everything I ever wanted? Just like that. And it mean anything. What then? I don't understand, said the whispery voice. Of course you don't understand, she said, raising the stone with the hole in her eye. With the hole to her eye. You're just a bad copy she made of the crazy old man upstairs. Not even that anymore, said the dead, whispery voice. There was a glow coming from the raincoat of the man, at about chest height. Through the hole in the stone, the glow twinkled and shone blue-white as any star. She wished she had a stick or something to poke him with. She had no wish to get any closer to the shadowy man at the end of the room. And from under the coat and hat, a score or more of them, red eyes shining in the dark. They chittered and they fled. The coat fluttered and fell heavily on the floor. The hat rolled into one corner of the room. Coraline reached out one hand and pulled it open. It was empty, although it was greasy touch. There was no sign of the final glass marble in it. She scanned the room, squinting through the hole in the stone, and caught sight of something that twinkled and burned like a star at floor level by the doorway. It was being carried in the forepaws of the largest black rat. As she looked, it slipped away. The other rats watched her from the corners of the room as she ran after it. Now, rats can run faster than people, especially over short distances. But a large black rat holding a marble in its two front paws is no match for a determined girl, even if she is small for her age, moving at a run. Smaller black rats, back and forth across her path, trying to distract her, but she ignored them all, keeping her eyes fixed on the one with the marble, who was heading straight out the flat toward the front door. They reached the steps on the outside of the building. Coraline had time to observe that the house itself was continuing to change, becoming less distinct and flattening out even as she reached down the stairs. It reminded her of a photograph of a house now, not the thing itself. Then she was racing, pell-mell down the steps in pursuit of the rat, with no room in her mind for anything else, certain she was gaining on it. She was running fast, too fast, she discovered, as she came down to the bottom of one flight of stairs, and her foot skidded and twisted, and she went crashing onto the concrete landing. Her left knee was scraped and skinned, and the palm of one hand she had thrown out to stop herself was a mess of scraped skin and grit. It hurt a little, and it would, she knew, soon hurt much more. She picked the grit out of her palm and climbed to her feet, and as fast as she could, knowing that she had lost, and it was already too late, she went down to the final landing at the ground level. She looked around for the rat, but it was gone, and the marble with it. Her hands stung where the skin had been scraped, and there was blood trickling down her ripped pajama leg from her knee. It was as bad as the summer that her mother had taken the training wheels off Coraline's bicycle, but then, back then, in with all the cuts and scrapes, her knees had had scabs on top of scabs. She had had a feeling of achievement. She was learning something, doing something she had not known how to do. Now she felt nothing but cold loss. She had failed the ghost children, she had failed her parents, she had failed herself, failed everything. She closed her eyes and wished that the earth would swallow her up. There was a cough. She opened her eyes and saw the rat. It was lying on the brick path at the bottom of the stairs with a surprised look on its face, which was now several inches away from the rest of it. Its whiskers were stiff, its eyes were wide open, its teeth visible and yellow and sharp. A collar of wet blood glistened at its neck. Beside the decapitated rat, a smug expression on its face, with the black cat. It had one paw on the gray glass marble. "I think I once mentioned," said the cat, "that I don't like rats at the best of times. It looked like you needed this one, however. I hope you don't mind my getting involved." "I think," said Coraline, trying to catch her breath, "I think you may have said something of the sort." The cat lifted its paw from the marble, which rolled toward Coraline. She picked it up. In her mind, a final voice whispered to her urgently, "She has lied to you. She will never give you up. Now she has you. She will no more give any of us up than change her nature." The hairs on the back of Coraline's neck prickled, and Coraline knew that the girl's voice told the truth. She put the marble in her dressing gown pocket with the others. She had 3 marbles now. All she needed to do was find her parents. And Coraline realized with surprise that bit was easy. She knew exactly where her parents were. If she had stopped to think, she might have known where they were all along. The other mother could not create. She could only transform and twist and change. The mantelpiece in the drawing room back home was quite empty, but knowing that, she knew something else as well. The other mother. She plans to break her promise. She won't let us go, said Coraline. I wouldn't put it past her, admitted the cat. Like I said, there's no guarantee she'll play fair. And then he raised his head. Hello. Did you see that? What? Look behind you, said the cat. The house had flattened out even more. It no longer looked like a photograph, more like a drawing, a crude charcoal scribble of a house drawn on gray paper. Whatever's happening, said Coraline, thank you for helping me with the rat. I suppose I'm almost there, aren't I? So you go off into the mist, or wherever you go, and I hope I get to see you at home. If she lets me go home. The cat's fur was on end, and its tail was bristling like a chimney sweep's brush. What's wrong? Asked Coraline. They've gone, said the cat. They aren't there anymore. the ways in and out of this place. They just went flat. Is that bad? The cat lowered its tail, switching it from side to side angrily. It made a low growling noise in the back of its throat. It walked in a circle until it was facing away from Coraline, and then it began to walk backwards, stiffly, one step at a time, until it was pushing up against Coraline's leg. She put down a hand to stroke it, and could feel how hard its heart was beating. It was trembling like a dead leaf in a storm. "You'll," said Coraline. "Everything's going to be fine. I'll take you home." The cat said nothing. "Come on, cat," said Coraline. She took a step back, but the cat stayed where it was, looking miserable and oddly much smaller. "If the only way out is past her, Coraline, then that's the way we're going to go." She went back to the cat, bent down, and picked it up. The cat did not resist. It simply trembled. She supported its bottom with one hand, rested its front legs on her shoulders. The cat was heavy, but not too heavy to carry. It licked at the palm of her hand where the blood from the scrape was welling up. Coraline walked up the stairs one step at a time, heading back to her own flat. She was aware of the marbles clicking in her pocket, aware of the stone with the hole in it, aware of the cat pressing itself against her. She got to her front door now. Just a small child's scrawl of a door, and she pushed her hand against it, half expecting that her hand would rip through it, revealing nothing behind it but blood and a scattering of stars. But the door swung open and Coraline went through. Once inside, in her flat, or rather in the flat that was not hers, Coraline was pleased to see that it had not transformed into the empty drawing that the rest of the house seemed to have become. It had depth and shadows, and someone who stood in the shadows waiting for Coraline to return. "So you're back," said the other mother. She did not sound pleased. "And you brought vermin with you." "No," said Coraline. "I brought a friend." She could feel the cat stiffening under her hands, as if it were anxious to be away. Coraline wanted to hold on to it like a teddy bear for reassurance, but she knew that cats hate to be squeezed. And she suspected that frightened cats were liable to bite and scratch if provoked in any way, even if they were on your side. "You know I love you," said the other mother flatly. "You have a very funny way of showing it," said Coraline. She walked down the hallway, then turned into the drawing room, steady step by step, pretending that she could not feel the other mother's blank black eyes. Her grandmother's formal furniture was still there, and the painting on the wall of the strange fruit, but now the fruit in the painting had been eaten, and all that remained in the bowl was the browning core of an apple, several plum and peach stones, and the stem of what had formerly been a bunch of grapes. The lion-paw table raked the carpet with its clawed wooden feet, impatient for something. At the end of the room, in the corner, stood the wooden door, which had once, in another place, opened onto a plain brick wall. Coraline tried not to stare at it. The window showed nothing but mist. This was it, Coraline knew. The moment of truth, the unraveling time. The other mother had followed her in. Now she stood in the center of the room between Coraline and the mantelpiece, and looked down at Coraline with black button eyes. It was funny, Coraline thought. The other mother did not look anything at all like her own mother. She wondered how she had ever been deceived into imagining a resemblance. The other mother was huge. Her head almost brushed the ceiling, and very pale, the color of a spider's belly. Her hair writhed and twined about her head, and her teeth were sharp as knives. "Well," said the other mother sharply, "where are they?" Coraline leaned against an armchair, adjusted the cat with her left hand, put her right hand into her pocket, and pulled out the 3 glass marbles. They were a frosted gray, and they clinked together in the palm of her hand. The other mother reached her white fingers for them, but Coraline slipped them back into her pocket. She knew it was true then. The other mother had no intention of letting her go, or of keeping word. It had been an entertainment and nothing more. "Hold on," she said. "We aren't finished yet, are we?" The other mother looked daggers, but she smiled sweetly. "No," she said, "I suppose not. After all, you still need to find your parents, don't you?" "Yes," said Coraline. "I must not look at the mantelpiece," she thought. "I must not even look at it." "Well," said the other mother, "produce them. Would you like to look in the cellar again? I have some other interesting things hidden down there, you know." "No," said Coraline. "I know where my parents are." The cat was heavy in her arms. She moved it forward, unhooking its claws from her shoulder as it did so. "Where?" "It stands no reason. It stands to reason," said Coraline. "I've looked everywhere." "You'd hide them." "They aren't in the house." The other mother stood very still, giving nothing away, lips tightly closed. She might have been a wax statue. Even her hair had stopped moving. "So," Coraline continued, both hands wrapped firmly around the black cat, "I know where they have to be. You've hidden them in the passageway between the houses, haven't you? They are behind that door." She nodded her head toward the door in the corner. The other mother remained statue still, but a hint of a smile crept back onto her face. "Oh, they are they?" "Why don't you open it?" said Coraline. "They'll be there all right." It was her only way home, she knew. But it all depended on the other mother's needing to gloat, needing not only to win, but to show that she had won. The other mother reached her hand slowly into her apron pocket and produced the black iron key. The cat stirred uncomfortably in Coraline's arms as if it wanted to get down. "Just stay there for a few moments longer," she thought. She thought at it, wondering if it could hear her. "I'll get us both home. I said I would, I promise." She felt the cat relax ever so slightly in her arms. The other mother walked over to the door and pushed the key into the lock. She turned the key. Coraline heard the mechanism clunk heavily. She was already starting, as quietly as she could, step by step away toward the mantelpiece. The other mother pushed down on the door handle and pulled open the door, revealing a corridor behind it, dark and empty. "There," she said, waving her hands at the corridor. The expression of delight on her face was a very bad thing to see. "You're wrong. You don't know where your parents are, do you? They aren't there." She turned and looked at Coraline. "Now," she said, "you're going to stay here forever and always." "No," said Coraline, "I'm not." And, hard as she could, she threw the black cat toward the other mother. It yowled and landed on the other mother's head, claws flailing, teeth showing fierce and angry, fur on end. It looked half again as big as it was in real life. Without waiting to see what would happen, Coraline reached up to the mantelpiece and closed her hand around the snow globe, pushing it deep into the pocket of her dressing gown. The cat made a deep yowl and sank its teeth into the other mother's cheek. She was flailing at it. Blood ran on her face. Not red blood, but a deep, tarry black. Coraline ran for the door. She pulled the key out of the lock. "Leave her! Come on!" she shouted to the cat. It hissed and swiped its scalpel-sharp claws at the other mother's face in one wild rake, which left black ooze trickling from several gashes on other mother's nose. Then it sprang down toward Coraline. "Quickly!" she said. The cat ran toward her, and then they both stepped into the dark corridor. It was colder in the corridor, like stepping down into a cellar on a warm day. The cat hesitated for a moment, then seeing the other mother was coming toward them, it ran to Coraline and stopped by her legs. Coraline began to pull the door closed. It was heavier than she imagined a door could be, and it pulled it closed. Was like trying to... I'm getting excited. And pulling it closed was like trying to close a door against a high wind. And then she felt something from the other side starting to pull against her. "Shut!" she thought. Then she said out loud, "Come on, please!" And she felt the door begin to move, to pull closed, to give against the phantom wind. Suddenly she was aware of other people in the corridor with her. She could not turn her head to look at them, but she knew them without having to look. "Help me, please," she said, "all of you." The other people in the corridor, the 3 children, 2 adults, were somehow too insubstantial to touch the door, but their hands closed about hers as she pulled on the big iron door handle, and suddenly she felt strong. "Never let up, miss. Hold strong. Hold strong," whispered in her mind. "Pull, girl, pull," whispered another. Then a voice that sounded like her mother's, her own mother, her real, wonderful, maddening, infuriating, glorious mother, just said, "Well done, Coraline." Enough. The door started to slip closed easily as anything. "No!" screamed a voice from beyond the door. "No!" And it no longer sounded even faintly human. Something snatched at Coraline, reaching through the closing gap between the door and the doorpost. Coraline jerked her head out of the way, but the door began to open once more. "We're going to go home," said Coraline. "We are. Help me." She ducked the snatching fingers. They moved through her then. Ghost hands lent her strength that she no longer possessed. There was a final moment of resistance, as if something were caught in the door, and then with a crack, the wooden door banged closed. Something dropped from Coraline's head height to the floor. It landed with a sort of scuttling thump. "Come on," said the cat. "This is not a good place to be. Quickly." Coraline turned her back on the door and began to run as fast as was practical. Through the dark corridor, running her hand along the wall to make sure she didn't bump into anything or get turned around in the darkness. It was an uphill run, and it seemed to her that it went on for a longer distance than anything could possibly go. The wall she was touching felt warm and yielding now, and she realized. It felt as if it were covered in a fine, downy fur. It moved as if it were taking a breath. She snatched her hand away from it. Winds howled in the dark. She was scared she would bump into something, and she put out her hand for the wall once more. This time what she touched felt hot and wet, as if she had put her hand in somebody's mouth, and she pulled it back with a small wail. Her eyes had adjusted to the dark. She could half see, as faintly glowing patches ahead of her, 2 adults, 3 children. She could hear the cat, too, padding in the dark in front of her. And there was something else, which suddenly scuttled between her feet, nearly sending Coraline flying. She caught herself before she went down, using her own momentum to keep moving. She knew that if she fell in that corridor, she might never... Whatever that corridor was older by far than the other mother. It was deep and slow, and knew that she was there. Then daylight appeared, and she ran toward it, puffing and wheezing. "Almost there," she called encouragingly, but in the light she discovered the wraiths had gone, and she was alone. She did not have time to wonder what had happened to them. Panting for breath, she staggered through the door and slammed it behind her with the loudest, most satisfying bang you can imagine. Coraline locked the door with the key and put the key back into her pocket. The black cat was huddled in the farthest corner of the room, the pink tip of its tongue showing, its eyes wide. Coraline went over to it and crouched down beside it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I threw you at her, but it was the only way to distract her enough to get us all out. She would have never kept her word, would she?" The cat looked up at her, then rested its head on her hand, licking her fingers with its sandpapery tongue. It began to purr. "Then we're friends?" said Coraline. She sat down on one of her grandmother's uncomfortable armchairs, and the cat sprang up into her lap and made itself comfortable. The light that came through the picture window was daylight. Real golden late afternoon daylight, not a white mist light. The sky was a robin's egg blue, and Coraline could see trees, and beyond the trees green hills which faded on the horizon into purples and grays. The sky had never seemed so sky. The world had never seemed so world. Coraline stared at the leaves on the trees and at the patterns of light and shadow on the cracked bark of the trunk of the beech tree outside the window. Then she looked down at her lap, at the way that the rich sunlight brushed every hair on the cat's head, turning each white whisker to gold. Nothing, she thought, had ever been so interesting. And caught up in the interestingness of the world, Coraline barely noticed that she had wriggled down and curled cat-like on her grandmother's uncomfortable armchair, nor did she notice when she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Her mother shook her gently awake. "Coraline," she said, "darling, what a funny place to fall asleep, and really, this room is only for best. We looked all over the house for you." Coraline stretched and blinked. I'm sorry," she said. "I fell asleep." "I can see that," said her mother. "And wherever did the cat come from?" "He was waiting by the front door when I came in. Shot out like a bullet as I opened it." Probably had things to do," said Coraline. Then she hugged her mother so tightly that her arms began to ache. Her mother hugged Coraline back. "Dinner in 15 minutes, said her mother. "Don't forget to wash your hands, and just look at those pajama bottoms. What did you do to your poor knee?" "I tripped," said Coraline. She went into the bathroom and she washed her hands and cleaned her bloody knee. She put ointment on her cuts and scrapes. She went into her bedroom, her real bedroom, her true bedroom. She pushed her hands into the pockets of her dressing gown and she pulled out 3 marbles, a stone with a hole in it, the black key, and an empty snow globe. She shook the snow globe and watched the glittery snow swirl through the water to fill the empty world. She put it down and watched the snow fall, covering the place where the little once stood. Coraline took a piece of string from her toy box, and she strung the black key on the string. Then she knotted the string and hung it around her neck. "There," she said. She put on some clothes and hid the key under her t-shirt. It was cold against her skin. The stone went into her pocket. Coraline walked down the hallway to her father's study. He had his back to her, but she knew, just on seeing him, that his eyes, when he turned around, would be her father's kind, gray eyes, and she crept over and kissed him on the back of his balding head. "Hello, Coraline," he said. Then he looked around and smiled at her. "What was this for?" "Nothing," said Coraline. "I just miss you sometimes, that's all." "Oh, good," he said. And he put the computer to sleep, stood up, and then, for no reason at all, he picked Coraline up which he had not done for such a long time, not since he had started pointing out to her she was much too old to be carried, and he carried her into the kitchen. Dinner that night was pizza, and even though it was homemade by her father, so the crust was alternately thick and doughy and raw, or too thin and burnt, and even though he had put slices of green pepper on it, along with little meatballs and, of all things, pineapple chunks, Coraline ate the entire slice she had been given. Well, she ate everything except for the pineapple chunks. And soon enough, it was bedtime. Coraline kept the key around her neck, but she put the gray marbles beneath her pillow, and in bed that night, Coraline dreamed a dream. She was at a picnic under an old oak tree in a green meadow. The sun was high in the sky, and while there were distant, fluffy white clouds on the horizon, the sky above her head was a deep, untroubled blue. There was a white linen cloth laid on the grass, white bowls piled high with food. She could see salads and sandwiches, nuts and fruit, jugs of lemonade and water and thick chocolate milk. Coraline sat on one side of the tablecloth while 3 other children took a side each. They were dressed in the oldest clothes. The smallest of them, sitting on Coraline's left, was a boy in red velvet knee breeches, and a frilly white shirt. His face was he was piling his plate high with boiled new potatoes and with what looked like cold, whole-cooked trout. "This is the finest of picnics, lady," he said to her. "Yes," said Coraline. "I think it is. I organized it." "Why, I rather think you did, miss," said a tall girl sitting opposite Coraline. She wore a brown, rather shapeless dress, and had a brown bonnet on her head which tied beneath her chin. "And we are more grateful for it and for all than ever words can say." She was eating slices of bread and jam, deftly cutting the bread from a large golden brown loaf with a huge knife, then spooning on the purple jam with a wooden spoon. She had jam in her mouth. "Aye, this is the finest food I have eaten in centuries," said the girl on Coraline's right. She was a pale child, dressed in what seemed to be spider's webs, with a circle of glittering silver set in her blonde hair. Coraline could have sworn that the girl had 2 wings, like dusty silver butterfly wings, not bird wings, coming out of her back. The girl's plate was piled high with pretty flowers. She smiled at Coraline, as if it had been a very long time since she had smiled, and she had almost, but not quite, forgotten how. Coraline found herself liking this girl immensely, and then, in the way of dreams, the picnic was done, and they were playing in the meadow, running and shouting and tossing and glittering ball from one to another. Coraline knew it was a dream then, because none of them ever got tired or winded or out of breath. She wasn't even sweating. They just laughed and ran in a game that was partly tag, partly piggy in the middle, and partly just a magnificent romp. 3 of them ran along the ground, while the pale girl fluttered a little over their heads, swooping down on butterfly wings to grab the ball and swing up again into the sky before she tossed the ball to one of the other children. And then, without a word about it being spoken, the game was done, and the 4 of them went back to the picnic cloth where the lunch dishes had been cleared away, and there were 4 bowls waiting for them, 3 of ice cream, 1 of honeysuckle flowers piled high. They ate with relish. "Thank you for coming to my party," said Coraline, as if it is mine." "The pleasure is ours, Coraline Jones," said the winged girl, nibbling another honeysuckle blossom. If there were but something we could do for you, to thank you and to reward you." "Eh," said the boy with the red velvet breeches and the dirty face. He put out his hand and held Coraline's hand with his own. It was warm now. "It's a very fine thing you did for us, miss," said the tall girl. She now had a smear of chocolate ice cream around her lips. "I'm just pleased it's all over," said Coraline. Was it her imagination, or did a shadow cross the faces of the other children at the picnic? The winged girl the circlet in her hair glittering like a star, resting her fingers for a moment on the back of Coraline's hand. "It is over and done with for us," she said. "This is our staging post. From here, we three will set out for uncharted lands. Comes after no one alive can say." She stopped talking. "There's a but, isn't there?" said Coraline. "I can feel it like a rain cloud." The boy on her left tried to smile bravely, but his lower lip began to tremble, and he bit it with his upper teeth and said nothing. The girl in the brown bonnet shifted uncomfortably and said, "Yes, miss." "But I got you three back," said Coraline. I got Mom and Dad back. I shut the door. I locked it. What I meant to do?" The boy squeezed Coraline's hand with his. She found herself remembering when it had been she trying to reassure him, when he was a little more than a cold memory in the darkness. "Well, can't you give me a clue?" asked Coraline. "Isn't there something you can tell me?" "The beldam swore by her good right hand," said the tall girl, "but she lied." My governess," said the boy, "used to say that nobody is ever given more to shoulder than he or she can bear." He shrugged as he said this, as if he had not yet made his own mind up whether or not it was true. "We wish you luck," said the girl. "Good fortune and wisdom and courage, although you have already shown that you have all three of these blessings, and in abundance." "She hates you," blurted out the boy. "She hasn't lost anything for so long. Be wise, be brave, be tricky." "But it's not fair," said Coraline in her dream angrily. "It's just not fair. It should be over." The boy with the dirty face stood up and hugged Coraline tightly. "Take comfort in this," he whispered. "Thou art alive. Thou livest." And in her dream Coraline saw that the sun had set and the stars were twinkling in the darkening sky. Coraline stood in the meadow and she watched as the three children, two of them walking, one flying, went away from her across the grass, silver in the light of the huge moon. The three of them came to a small wooden bridge over a stream. They stopped there and turned and Coraline waved back. And what came after was darkness. Coraline woke in the early hours of the morning, convinced she had heard something moving, but was unsure what it was. She waited. Something made a rustling noise outside her bedroom door. She wondered if it was a rat. The door rattled. Coraline clambered out of bed. "Go away," said Coraline sharply. "Go away, or you'll be sorry." There was a pause. Then the whatever it was scuttled away down the hall. There was something odd and irregular about its footsteps. If they were footsteps. Coraline found herself wondering if it was perhaps a rat with an extra leg. "It isn't over, is it?" she said to herself. Then she opened the bedroom door. The gray neon light showed her the whole of the corridor completely deserted. She went back toward the front door, sprang a hasty glance back at the wardrobe door mirror hanging on the wall at the other end of the hallway, seeing nothing but her own pale face staring back at her, looking sleepy and serious. Gentle, reassuring snores came from her parents' room, but the door was closed. All the doors of the corridor were closed. Whatever the scuttling thing was, it had to be here somewhere. Coraline opened the front door and looked at the gray sky. She wondered how long it would be until the sun came up, wondering whether her dream had been a true thing, while knowing in her heart that it had been. Something she had taken to be part of the shadows under the hall couch detached itself from beneath the couch and made a mad, doubling rush on its long white legs, heading for the front door. Coraline's mouth dropped open in horror, and she stepped out of the way as the thing clicked and scuttled past her and out of the house, running crab-like on its too many tapping, clicking, scurrying feet. She knew what it was, and she knew what it was after. She had seen it too many times in the last few days, reaching and clutching and snatching and popping black beetles obediently into the other mother's mouth. 5-footed, crimson-nailed, the color of bone. It was the other mother's right hand. It wanted the black key. Oh. So I've been reading for a good chunk of time. There's still more left to the story. If you all are okay with me returning and reading the rest of it, possibly, I would say sometime early next week. Let me know. Or we could power through if you want to finish. It seems that we are currently on chapter 13. I haven't been looking at the comments at all this whole time, but that's probably better for me because I'm antisocial and people make me nervous, even though I'm sure you're all very lovely. Hi, everybody. I don't know who Jen is. My name is Jasleiney. Some people call me Jazz. And at times, people call me Artemia. It's nice to take a break, though. Right? I just didn't want to take a break because I myself was getting really caught up with this story. It's really good. You like my sweater? It has a little bit of color. It's probably my grandma's favorite sweater. Let me see. Well, it seems that there's about... There's about, I'd say, like 18 more pages. What do you say? Finish? We've gotten this far, huh? I have a very itchy face, and I don't know why. And now I'm taking the time to... Sometimes I think I was a cat in a past life. How are the candles doing? Oh, good. You know, I think that I'm going to finish it because it's only about 18 more pages. And we can put an end to Coraline. When I do another live stream, I am thinking of reading some Edgar Allan Poe. I know some of my cousins are also wanting to do some live readings. I think Lorenzo wants to come back. And my little cousin, Michi, she's been really influenced by me and Lorenzo doing live readings. So I think she was telling me something about a book she wants to read. Oh, my computer is really hot. I'm really glad that you're all enjoying the narration. This is 100% a cold read, so sometimes I do fumble on words. But I'm pretty, happy with how I've done, thankfully. It's not perfect. It's not audiobook worthy, but it's something. Okay, so let's let's finish this up. We're on chapter 13. We're almost at the end of Coraline. Coraline's parents never seemed to remember anything about their time in the snow globe. At least they never said anything about it, and Coraline never mentioned it to them. Sometimes she wondered whether they had ever noticed that they had lost 2 days in the real world, and came to the eventual conclusion that they had not. Then again, there are some people who keep track of every day and every hour, and there are people who don't, and Coraline's parents were solidly in the second camp. Coraline had placed the marbles beneath her pillow before she went to sleep that first night home in her own room once more. She went back to bed after she saw the other mother's hand, although there was not much time left for sleeping, and she rested her head back on the pillow. Something scrunched gently as she did. She sat up and lifted the pillow. The fragments of the glass marbles that she saw looked like remains of eggshells, finds beneath trees in springtime, like empty, broken robin's eggs, or even more delicate, wren's eggs, perhaps. Whatever you had inside the glass spheres had gone. Coraline thought of the 3 children waving goodbye to her in the moonlight, waving before they crossed that silver stream. She gathered up the eggshell-thin fragments with care and placed them in a small blue box which had once held a bracelet that her grandmother had given her when she was a little girl. The bracelet was long lost, but the box remained. Miss Spink and Miss Forcible came back from visiting Miss Spink's niece, and Coraline went down to their flat for tea. It was a Monday. On Wednesday, Coraline would go back to school. A whole new school year would begin. Miss Forcible, instead of reading Coraline's tea leaves, Miss Forcible insisted on reading Coraline's tea leaves. "Well, looks like everything's mostly ship-shape. And Bristol fashion, lovey," said Miss Forcible. "Sorry?" said Coraline. "Everything is coming up roses," said Miss Forcible. "Well, almost everything. I'm not sure what that is." She pointed to a clump of tea leaves sticking to the side of the cup. Miss Spink reached for the cup and tutted. "Honestly, Miriam, give it over here. Let me see." She blinked through her thick spectacles. "Oh, dear. No, I have no idea what that signifies. It looks almost like a hand." Coraline looked. The clump of leaves did look like a hand reaching for something. Hamish, the Scotty dog, was hiding under Miss Forcible's chair, and he wouldn't come out. "I think he was in some sort of fight," said Miss Spink. "He has a deep gash in his side, poor dear. We'll take him to the vet later this afternoon. I wish I knew what could have done it." Something, Coraline knew, had to be done. That final week of the holidays, the weather was magnificent, as if the summer itself were trying to make up for the miserable weather they had been having by giving them some bright and glorious days before it ended. The crazy old man upstairs called down to Coraline when he saw her coming out of Miss Spink and Miss Forcible's flat. "Hey! Hi, you, Caroline!" he shouted over the railing. "It's Coraline," she said. "How are the mice?" "Something has frightened them," said the old man, scratching his mustache. "I think maybe there is a weasel in the house. Something is about. I heard it in the night. In my country, we would have put down a trap for it. We put down a little meat or hamburger, and when the creature comes to feast, then bam! It would be caught to never bother us more. The mice are so scared, they will not even pick up their little musical instruments." "I don't think it wants meat," said Coraline. She put her hand up and touched the black key that hung about her neck. Then she went back inside. She bathed herself and kept the key the whole time she was in the bath. She never took it off anymore. Something scratched at her bedroom window after she went to bed. Coraline was almost asleep, but she slipped out of her bed and pulled open the curtains. A white hand with crimson fingernails leapt from the window ledge onto a drain pipe and was immediately out of sight. There were deep gouges in the glass on the other side of the window. Coraline slept uneasily that night, waking from time to time to plot and plan and ponder, then falling back into sleep, never quite certain where her pondering ended and the dream began. one ear always open for the sound of something scratching at her window pane or at her bedroom door. In the morning, Coraline said to her mother, "I'm going to have a picnic with my dolls today. Can I borrow a sheet? An old one you don't need any longer, as a tablecloth?" "I don't think we have one of those," said her mother. She opened the kitchen drawer that held the napkins and the tablecloths, and she prodded about it. "Hold on. Will this do?" It was a folded-up, disposable paper tablecloth covered with red flowers left over from the picnic they had been on several years before. "That's perfect," said Coraline. "I didn't think you played with your dolls any more," said Miss Jones. "I don't," admitted Coraline. "They're, protective coloration." "Well, be back in time for lunch," said her mother. "Have a good time." Coraline filled a cardboard box with dolls, and with several plastic dolls' teacups. She filled a jug with water. Then she went outside. She walked down to the road just as if she were going to the shops. Before she reached the supermarket, she cut across a fence into some wasteland and along an old drive, then crawled under a hedge. She had to go under the hedge in 2 journeys in order not to spill the water from the jug. It was a long, roundabout, looping journey, but at the end of it, Coraline was satisfied that she had not been followed. She came out behind the dilapidated old tennis court. She crossed over it to the meadow where the long grass swayed. She found the planks on the edge of the meadow. They were astonishingly heavy, almost too heavy for a girl to lift, even using all her strength, but she managed. She didn't have any choice. She pulled the planks out of the way, one by one, grunting and sweating with the effort, revealing a deep, round, brick-lined hole in the ground. It smelled of damp in the dark. The bricks were greenish and slippery. She spread out the tablecloth and laid it carefully over the top of the well. She put a plastic doll's cup every foot or so at the edge of the well, and she weighed each cup down with water from the jug. She put a doll in the grass beside each cup, making it look as much like a doll's tea party as she could. Then she retracted her steps back under the hedge, along the dusty yellow drive, around the back of the shops, back to her house. She reached up and took the key from around her neck. She dangled it from the string, as if the key were just something she liked to play with. Then she knocked on the door of Miss Spink and Miss Forcible's flat. Miss Spink opened the door. "Hello, dear," she said. "I don't want to come in," said Coraline. "I just wanted to find out how Hamish is doing." Miss Spink sighed. "Well, the vet says that Hamish is a brave little soldier," she said. "Luckily, the cut doesn't seem to be infected. We cannot imagine what could have done it. The vet says some animal, he thinks, but has no idea what. Mr. Bobo says he thinks it might have been a weasel." "Mr. Bobo?" "The man in the top flat, Mr. Bobo. Fine old circus family, I believe. Romanian or Slovenian or Livonian or one of those countries. Bless me, I can never remember them any more." It had never occurred to Coraline. Look at me. Sorry, Coraline. It had never occurred to Coraline that the crazy old man upstairs actually had a name, she realized. If she'd known his name was Mr. Bobo, she would have said it every chance she got. How often do you get to say a name like Mr. Bobo out loud? "Oh," said Coraline to Miss Spink. "Mr. Bobo, right. Well," she said a little louder, "I'm going to go and play with my dolls now, over by the old tennis court round the back." "That's nice, dear," said Miss Spink. Then she added confidently, "Make sure you keep an eye out for the old well. Mr. Lovett, who was here before your time, said that he thought it might go down for a half a mile or more." Coraline hoped that the hand had not heard this last, and she changed the subject. "This key?" said Coraline loudly. "Oh, it's just some old key from our house. It's part of my game. That's why I'm carrying it around with me on this piece of string. Well, goodbye now." "What an extraordinary child," said Miss Spink to herself as she closed the door. Coraline ambled across the meadow toward the old tennis court, dangling and swinging the black key on its piece of string as she walked. Several times she thought she saw something the color of bone in the undergrowth. It was keeping pace with her, about 30 feet away. She tried to whistle, but nothing happened, so she sang out loud instead, a song her father had made up for her when she was a little baby, and which had always made her laugh. And it went, "Oh, my twitchy witchy girl, I think you are so nice. I give you bowls of porridge and I give you bowls of rice cream. I give you lots of kisses and I give you lots of hugs, but I never give you sandwiches with bugs in." That was what she sang as she sauntered through the woods, and her voice hardly trembled at all. The doll's tea party was where she had left it. She was relieved that it was not a windy day, for everything was still in its place. The water-filled plastic cup weighed down the paper tablecloth as it was meant to. She breathed a sigh of relief. Now was the hardest part. "Hello, dolls," she said brightly. "It's tea time." She walked close to the paper tablecloth. "I brought the lucky key," she told the dolls, "to make sure a good picnic." And then, as carefully as she could, she leaned over and gently placed the key on the tablecloth. She was still holding on to the string. She held her breath, hoping that the cups of water at the edges of the well would weigh the cloth down, letting it take the key down without collapsing into the well. The key sat in the middle of the paper picnic cloth. Coraline let go of the string and took a step back. Now it was all up to the hand. She turned to her dolls. "Would you like a piece of cherry cake?" she asked. "Jemima, Pinky, Primrose?" And she served each doll a slice of invisible cake on an invisible plate, chattering happily as she did so. From the corner of her eye she saw something bone-white scamper from one tree trunk to another, closer and closer. She forced herself not to look at it. "Jemima," said Coraline, "what a bad girl you are! You've dropped your cake! Now I'll have to go over and get you a whole new slice." And she walked around the tea party she was to the hand. She pretended to clean up spilled cake and to get Jemima another piece. And then, in a skittering, chittering rush, it came, the hand. Running high on its fingertips, scrabbled through the tall grass and up onto a tree stump. It stood there for a moment like a crab tasting the air, and then it made one triumphant, nail-clacking leap onto the center of the tablecloth. Time slowed for Coraline. The white fingers closed around the black key, and then the weight and the momentum of the hand sent the plastic doll's cups flying, and the paper tablecloth, the key, and the other mother's right hand went tumbling down into the darkness of the well. Coraline counted slowly under her breath. She got up to 40 before she heard a muffled splash coming from a long way below. Someone had once told her that if you look up at the sky from the bottom of a mine shaft, even in the brightest daylight, you see a night sky and stars. Coraline wondered if the hand could see stars from where it was. She hauled the heavy planks back onto the well, covering it as carefully as she could. She didn't want anything to fall in. She didn't want anything ever to get out. Then she put her dolls and the cups back in the cardboard box she had carried them out in. Something caught her eye while she was doing this, and she straightened up in time to see the black cat stalking toward her, its tail held high and curling the tip like a question mark. It was the first time she had seen the cat in several days, since they had returned together from the other mother's place. The cat walked over to her and jumped up onto the planks that covered the well. Then, slowly, it winked one eye at her. It sprang down into the long grass in front of her and rolled over onto its back, wiggling about ecstatically. Coraline scratched and tickled the soft fur on its belly, and the cat purred contently. When it had had enough, it rolled over onto its front once more and walked back towards the tennis court, a tiny patch of midnight in the midday sun. Coraline went back to the house. Mr. Bobo was waiting for her in the driveway. He clapped her on the shoulder. "The mice tell me that all is good," he said. "They say that you are our savior, Caroline." "It's Coraline, Mr. Bobo," said Coraline, "not Caroline. Coraline. Coraline, said Mr. Bobo, repeating her name to himself with wonderment and respect. Very good, Coraline. The mice say that I must tell you that as soon as they are ready to perform in public, you will come up and watch them as the first audience of all. They will play Tumty-Umpty and Toodle-Oodle, and they will dance and do 1,000 tricks. That is what is they say. I would like that very much, said Coraline, when they're ready. She knocked at Miss Spink and Miss Forcible's door. Miss Spink let her in, and Coraline went into their parlor. She put her box of dolls down on the floor, then she put her hand into her pockets and pulled out the stone with the hole in it. Here you go, she said. I don't need it any more. I'm very grateful. I think it may have saved my life and saved some other people's death. She gave them both tight hugs, although her arms barely stretched around Miss Spink, and Miss Forcible smelled like the raw garlic she had been cutting. Then Coraline picked up her box of dolls and went out. What an extraordinary child, said Miss Spink. No one had hugged her like that since she had retired from the theater. That night Coraline lay in bed, all bathed, teeth cleaned, with her eyes open, staring up at the ceiling. It was warm enough that now that the hand was gone, she had opened her bedroom window wide. She had insisted to her father that the curtains not be entirely closed. Her new school clothes were laid out carefully on her chair for her to put on when she woke. Normally, on the night before the first day of school, Coraline was apprehensive and nervous, but she realized there was nothing left about school that could scare her anymore. She fancied she could hear sweet music on the night air, the kind of music that can only be played on the tiniest silver trombones and trumpets and bassoons, or on piccolos and tubas so delicate and small that their keys could only be pressed by the tiny pink fingers of white mice. Coraline imagined that she was back in her dream with the 2 girls and the boy under the oak tree in the meadow, and she smiled. As the first stars came out, Coraline finally allowed herself to drift into sleep, while the gentle upstairs music of the mouse circus spilled out onto the warm evening air, telling the world that the summer was almost done. And with that, the story of Neil Gaiman's Coraline is complete. If you haven't seen the stop motion film, I highly suggest it. It's very good. And as you can see, the book is incredible. I think what's really interesting about the stop motion film is the addition of Wybie, her new male neighbor friend. I think that was a really cool addition to this story that was written. So thank you all so very much for joining. This has been really nice for me because as an introvert, I don't like going out much, and it's nice to connect with the world this way, where I don't necessarily have to see anybody, but you see me, and even though that's awkward, this is pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie. So hopefully next time, I will read some Edgar Allan Poe. If you have any suggestions for me or my cousins to read, obviously we need permission from the author, but thanks to what's going on with the pandemic and the quarantine, a lot of publishing companies and authors are allowing people to read their works out loud. And so Neil Gaiman actually gave me the thumbs up to read Coraline. So yeah, thank you guys so much. May everybody have a really cool and awesome Mother's Day. I know that I'm having a lunch with my mom, but she insists on cooking, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah, so happy Mother's Day, stay safe, and goodbye.